Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast on Chinese philosophy. My name is Richard Kim, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Loyola University Chicago.
And this is Justin Tewald, professor of philosophy at the University of Hong Kong.
All right. Well, today we're going to talk about our very first topic of this podcast series, which is detachment. But before we do that, I thought since this is our first episode, Justin, we should say a little bit about ourselves, maybe how we met, maybe also what we hope to achieve through this podcast.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I can keep it short. So, we're both specialists in Chinese philosophy, but we both kind of grew up and got a lot of our primary training in the English-speaking world. So, yeah, I teach in Hong Kong now, but I, for many years, taught in San Francisco, got my PhD at the University of Chicago. We're kind of in this English-speaking world where there are a lot of podcasts, but none devoted to Chinese philosophy in particular. And in the world of podcasting, there are a lot of niche markets, and this is definitely a niche market for which there's, it's not a big market, but definitely it's a niche, a really pronounced one. There are a lot of people who have an interest in this topic. And that's one way of putting it, is that we saw a need, and I'm happy to cast it that way if you want. But another way to put it is just to say that we're sort of colleagues and friends, and we've been in this classical Chinese reading group for some years now, where we off and on read the Zhuangzi with some other colleagues in the field. But being philosophers with wide-ranging interests, and, Richard, you have a kind of voracious philosophical appetite. You're always kind of seeing connections to other philosophical issues. We often digress and in the reading group. And sometimes we digress so much we realize we're going completely off the rails. And so we have to rein it in. We wanted to provide ourselves with a more freewheeling forum where we could actually indulge that side of us, where we do go beyond, disputes about what this particular line means or what this character means in this context, and talk about the kind of the larger philosophical significance of the Chinese philosophical text and share it with people. And not only that, but we're both philosophy teachers. So we are kind of accustomed to taking these difficult texts and making them accessible, pitching them at a level where everyone can see what's interesting and engaging about them, even if they don't have a lot of kind of training in Old Chinese, even if they know nothing about Old Chinese or anything about the history of Chinese thought. So it really is meant to be very accessible. We are going to indulge that part of us that wants to digress and explore tangentially related topics as we're looking at old Chinese texts.
Quite fair. So I think we do envision a broad audience. And I think we're both operating with this real belief that these Chinese texts have just very profound philosophical insight and wisdom to impart on us. Yeah. And I think as teachers, we've seen students for many years, learn much from these texts and in some ways transform their lives through it. Hopefully this podcast will help with that. And also, of course, we will, digress and we'll get into different philosophical topics. And I think at heart, we're both philosophers. So we're really interested in the questions and ideas, but we respect these Chinese texts, and we do think that they'll give us great insight into these questions. So I think that's basically what the podcast is about. And we're not getting paid for this. We're, we don't have to be doing this, but I think we both enjoyed immensely our conversations through the years. And I think, at least I can speak for myself, I've learned a lot from you, Justin. Justin is, of course, a master of classical Chinese, like our other friend PJ Ivanhoe, and I'm trying to, of course, still learn classical Chinese. My background is more in Western philosophical ethics, but yeah, I've spent some time in Hong Kong and learning classical Chinese, which has been just a tremendous blessing for me. And so I think through this podcast, we'll also interview a variety of other experts. We'll dive into really interesting philosophical questions in some of the most interesting, fascinating Chinese texts. And I do think that the audience will, or at least I hope, will benefit by listening to us.
That's really nice, Richard. You're really flattering me. I think it's a lifelong endeavor, learning classical Chinese. But I am a text geek, so I'll embrace that label if you want to apply it. I am interested in reading old texts and figuring them out. So you've already described what we hope to achieve with the podcast series. So all I can do is sort of second what you've just said, Richard. I think that's right. But then underscore that we really do mean for this to be something that non-experts can listen to. So we're not going to presuppose any familiarity with the Chinese language. And I'm going to be working very hard. Sometimes we'll have guests who are specialists in Chinese philosophy too. And when experts in Chinese philosophy are talking amongst themselves, of course, they drift into this form of conversation where everyone has some shared assumptions about the meaning of terms and where the interesting controversies lie and that kind of stuff. I'm really going to try my best to put on my undergraduate intro class teacher persona and provide context and remind people of, key terms and how they're understood and what the names refer to and that kind of thing. So one of the nice things about Chinese philosophy is that a great deal of it is actually pretty accessible. It's, you don't have to be deeply in the weeds and debates about the role of justification in knowledge or something in order to see the point. So much of it touches upon or has direct implications for how we ought to live, how we ought to live among other people, how we ought to govern, how we ought to achieve certain kinds of well-being or flourishing for ourselves, acquire virtues, find meaning, that kind of thing. So it's not hard to present these texts as relatable and philosophically engaging.
Yeah, supposedly good chefs are ones who just respect ingredients, right? So hopefully we'll be like good philosophical chefs and respect these texts and just bring to light their intrinsic value to their listeners.
Yeah, exactly. Their inherent value. Perfect. All right. So that's the plan. And for today, we are starting off with detachment in Taoism, the philosophy of the great Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi. So that's what's coming up after the short intermission in part 2. We're talking about detachment, Taoist detachment, but actually, if you're at all interested in the history of Chinese philosophy, it's usually worth your while to take a little bit care in figuring out which Taoist you have in mind. So basically, the classical Taoist tradition, sort of the foundations of Taoism, there are multiple sources and there are actually many early Taoist texts, but the two that by far are considered kind of part of the Taoist canon, kind of almost like Taoist scriptures, are the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. Now, the Tao Te Ching is the one that everyone seems to know, and it's been translated more than any other text except for the Judeo-Christian Bible. It's, often quoted. It seems like a lot of people, at least back in my day when I was growing up, would have a copy of it on their bookshelves. I remember trying to read it in high school and even sort of carrying it around to kind of cultivate the impression that I was reading this deep text, even though I didn't really understand it. But anyway, that's a very well-known one. But the Zhuangzi is quite a different text. Stylistically, the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi are very different. The Tao Te Ching is kind of poetic verse, whereas the Zhuangzi is, it's hard to describe. It's experimental arguments, trippy stories, funny anecdotes about major philosophical figures. It really reads like someone who's sort of both engaged in a kind of experimental literary project and also in philosophy at the same time. So of those two texts, we're going to look at the Zhuangzi today. So that's the latter one, the one that's more sort of experimental and trippy. Zhuangzi is spelled Zhuangzi. That's the latest way of spelling it, using the latest romanization system for Chinese characters. Some of you may have glanced at the text or the title of the text in the old romanization system, Wade Giles, where it was spelled Chuangtzu, Chuang Tzu, I guess is how you pronounce it. If you pronounce it like Zhuangzi, you're more likely to say it in a way that speakers of Mandarin Chinese will recognize. In any case, that's the text we're going to focus on. In the passage, we thought we'd start with a passage. This is sort of how we work as philosophers. So we thought this passage that we're going to call the Monkey Trainer passage is really interesting on the topic of Taoist detachment. It gives us a kind of model of detachment that still allows for someone who's detached to be involved in the world in some way. So it depicts a monkey trainer trying to figure out how to navigate a situation, sort of a tough situation with his monkeys. And it's not that, of course, he just gives up on his monkeys completely. That would be analogous, say, to giving up on society and becoming a hermit or what have you. There's a certain stereotype about Taoists that they're meant to be hermits or recluses, people who live far away from society. But in fact, I'm with a lot of other scholars of early Taoism and thinking that the Zhuangzi, at least, doesn't recommend that at all. So to borrow a phrase, a kind of really succinct way of describing it from Brian Van Norden, another scholar of Chinese philosophy, it seems like the Zhuangzi recommends detachment in society, not from society. And this monkey trainer passage gives us a kind of analogy or metaphor for that kind of detachment. We could say that the monkeys stand for human society and the monkey trainer stands for the sage, perhaps not. So anyway, that's all by way of introduction of the passage itself. maybe we should read it.
Okay, good. So the translation that I'm going to read from is the Paul Schallberg translation. And this is from chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi. Okay, so here's how it goes. When the monkey trainer was passing out nuts, he said, "You get 3 in the morning and 4 at night." The monkeys were all angry. "All right," he said, "you get 4 in the morning and 3 at night." The monkeys were all pleased. With no loss in name or substance, he made use of their joy and anger because he went along with them. So the sage harmonizes people with right and wrong and rests them on heaven's wheel. This is called walking 2 roads.
Walking 2 roads, yes.
Yes, and I remember we translate this passage in our reading group, and it was very interesting. I remember we had a long conversation about this.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating passage for me. And it sort of exemplifies what I take to be one of the major themes, one of the central themes of the Taoist text of the Zhuangzi, which I sometimes call philosophical double vision. I don't know if I should use that. It seems like it's sometimes a useful framework for reading passages like this. So maybe I should say a little bit more about it. So there's no question that in the Zhuangzi, there are kind of 2 points of view that are often interplaying, sort of interacting with one another. And it's sort of so widely observed that you'll see, some critics of Zhuangzi make reference to these 2 points of view, or these 2 kind of perspectives. So just for now, we'll call one of them the heavenly perspective and the other the human perspective. So the human perspective is the one that we all know very well because we live it. So it's the kind of perspective of finite creatures who are kind of passionately involved in projects and care about things and, care about their own success and failure and so on. So if I could just sort of pull out some distinctive features for Zhuangzi's purposes of the human perspective, I would say what matters a lot for the authors of the Zhuangzi, and it probably does have multiple authors, about the human perspective is just that finite. It's the point of view of people who have relatively limited experience. So in the very opening chapter of the Zhuangzi, it paints this really sort of, for me, powerful, compelling kind of image of a morning mushroom. So a mushroom that just sort of appears in the morning dew and then presumably dies or gets plucked up, or anyway doesn't last until nighttime. And you can imagine the morning mushroom, is making all these inferences, drawing all these conclusions about how the world works, not knowing that in fact there's this other thing that happens, which is the sun goes down, the moon comes up, the stars come out. There are multiple days and so on. Mm-hmm. And so the morning mushroom has such a tiny little limited experience about the world. And yet one imagines that it would draw all kinds of grand conclusions and be too quick to generalize and so on. And then the Zhuangzi contrasts the point of view of the morning mushroom with the point of view of these really ancient trees or tortoises. It kind of depends on which. There are these characters that could be read as referring to lots of different animals or plants. So there's, some debate about what they are, but we'll just say that they're an ancient tree and an ancient tortoise for whom a single spring or a single summer are the equivalent of thousands of years from our point of view. And it asks us to imagine what the world looks like from their perspective. Now, in my reading, what it's trying to do is sort of get us closer to what I want to call the heavenly perspective, which is the opposite of the human one. It's the infinite one. It's the more panoramic one. It's the one from which you can kind of see the full course of the history of the cosmos. You can see all events in the world and so on.
So real quick, the famous philosopher Thomas Nagel has this concept of the view from nowhere, how you would describe Zhuangzi's heavenly perspective as connected to Nagel's thought there. I'm sure you've probably thought about this.
Yeah, it's true. So it seems to me that we could easily spend, an hour just kind of doing fine-grained analysis of the subtle differences between the view from nowhere, as Nagel calls it, and the Zhuangzi view. But I still think it's worth kind of pointing to it, especially for people who are familiar with it. So there's a kind of term that's used in Western philosophy, the God's eye view, which is sort of how things look from God's point of view. And even philosophers who don't believe in God will use it just as sort of an expression that I think is meant to capture something like the heavenly point of view. So I think that that's an apt point of reference, an apt comparison.
So perspective with like full knowledge of everything, of every fact for all time.
Yeah, exactly. Full experience. That's right. Knowing every fact. And very importantly, having some sense of proportionality. So the idea is from the God's eye point of view, like whole civilizations rise and fall. And it's just, a blink of the eye. I mean, it's just one little event in the grand scheme of things. And so things that seem terribly important to you in your life or to me in my life are not only trivial, but vanishingly insignificant.
Yes. Have you seen this movie Tree of Life? It's
No, I
kind of
haven't.
one of those Cannes film. It's long.
Yeah.
It's kind of boring. It's slow. It's Sean Penn and what's his name from Fight Club, the main character. But
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm forgetting the actor's name.
It's okay. Most of the audience probably knows what you mean. As this podcast series continues, I think one of the themes of it will be how little Justin knows about pop culture. I still haven't seen Fight Club, although I'm aware that I should have. That
yes,
like in some
Brad
ways,
Pitt, by the way, yeah, that's the name.
Brad Pitt.
You've heard of Brad Pitt, I hope.
Yeah,
no, he's in it, and it's directed by Terrence Malick, who's a terrific director. He did The Thin Red Line. But anyways, that movie is supposed to be kind of this. It's a kind of theological reflection, according to some, where you get actually the movie begins from like supposedly the Big Bang. So you see 13.8 billion years ago, the universe starting. And then you see even like dinosaurs and just like the way that the universe is shaped and the earth is formed and evolution of other creatures. But then like most of the movie is about this one local family in somewhere, I think in Texas, Brad Pitt's family, and the struggles, the conflict and grappling with life and death. And the movie kind of portrays that two perspective where on the one hand, this local family in Texas at a certain point in time is engaging in all the joys, the ups and downs of human life that we all are very familiar with. But at the same time, the movie also depicts this panoramic vision and from which, and I think Job is also cited where, of course, Job is famous character from the Old Testament where, he suffers a lot and, he's supposed to be faithful and righteous to God. But then he's just wondering, like, why is this horrible stuff happening? And then there's this famous line where God responds by saying something like, where were you when the universe was formed? And so basically the thought there is, Job, you have no idea how the universe really operates. Your way is not my way, or my way is not your way. And that's actually often like some kind of defense that I've seen given about the problem of suffering, where, it's like, like when your child gets a shot, like they just think, they have no clue. They don't have the ability to make sense of it because, they're young and they don't have the knowledge. Sometimes you see theologians trying to also talk about that God perspective because maybe in some ways it's kind of beyond us.
Yeah, that's great.
So I was wondering if, maybe that kind of connects up with these two perspectives into Zhuangzi you're talking about.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, it's right. So actually, I think it is a theme that you sort of see in a lot of philosophy, especially philosophy that's meant to provide have some sort of therapeutic value for people who adopt it as almost as a practice or as a way of life. So yeah, that's very helpful. Pierre Dault wrote this book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. And I think it's an entire chapter where he talks about this view from above, which is a way of sort of capturing a certain perspective that he's writing about the sort of Hellenistic philosophers, the Greek and Roman ones. So he's thinking of Stoics and Epicureans. It's a way of capturing this idea that he finds in a lot of those early philosophers that you're supposed to sometimes just sort of step back and imagine, take a more panoramic kind of perspective on the world, which will help give you a sense of proportionality. So yeah, that's clearly one of the major effects of what I want to call the heavenly point of view. But I think I want to tie it into a couple of other themes that are really prominent especially in the so-called inner chapters of the Zhuangzi. So those are considered the core chapters 1-7. And so those two themes I'm going to say are skepticism and collapsing value distinctions. So one of those is easy to explain. And for people who know just a little bit about Taoism, it's pretty well known. So the Zhuangzi is known as a skeptical text. If we understand skepticism as the view that either all knowledge or that like certain really capacious classes of knowledge, like sensory knowledge or what have you, is basically not possible. It's not possible to have knowledge of certain kinds. Then you're a skeptic. And the Zhuangzi is famous for having arguments for really sort of broad sorts of skepticism. Has multiple dream arguments. Dream arguments are very popular in classical Taoist literature. It has so-called infinite regress arguments. So arguments that appeal to this idea that in order to know something, in some sense, you must know that you know it, which then presupposes that you must know that you know that you know it, so on and so forth. So anyway, there are lots of arguments like that meant to sort of raise serious doubts about whether we can really know anything. And so in the Zhuangzi, those arguments, I think, are meant basically to induce the heavenly perspective. So the heavenly point of view is one from which skepticism seems warranted. Doubts about the possibility of knowing things, knowing important things or knowing anything at all are warranted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's this tendency when you read the Zhuangzi, this really powerful one, to assume that in some sense, the heavenly point of view is the more authoritative one.
In fact, other classical Chinese scholars have thought this, right? Like Xunzi. So Xunzi, yes. I'm sure who will come up again because he's a very important classical Confucian thinker. There's this line in the Xunzi where he criticizes Zhuangzi for being overly focused on the natural or nature, but
no, it's heaven.
Something
he says
the heaven. Oh, does he say heaven there? Okay, as opposed to the human, right? So so Xunzi certainly thought that was what Zhuangzi was after, really just getting everyone to be lifted up into the heavenly perspective.
Yeah, exactly right. So as I said, a lot of early readers of the Zhuangzi sort of saw these two points of view, the heaven and the human points of view, heavenly and human points of view, as plain kind of being a really important framework for reading the text. And a critic of Zhuangzi named Xunzi, Xunzi, is a really, really great, interesting Confucian philosopher. He criticized Zhuangzi for being fixated on or sort of obsessed with the heavenly point of view. And if you saw it as nature, Richard, that's because oftentimes translators translate that word tian, heaven, as nature.
Right.
But yeah, so actually, I don't know. I want to say I agree and disagree with Xunzi's criticism of Zhuangzi. So on the one hand, he's right that Zhuangzi, like of the 2 points of view, Zhuangzi seems, I don't know, in some sense to give more weight or put more emphasis on the heavenly one. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk about ways in which maybe he emphasizes it too much. But I basically, in some deeper and most kind of more principled or fundamental sense, I disagree. I think that that the authors of the inner chapters, or maybe author singular, we don't know, that author goes way out of their way to say, in some sense, you're supposed to see the world from both points of view and in some sense live out both points of view. So, and that's what this, to get back to our passage about the monkey trainer, it ends with this idea that the monkey trainer is sort of an exemplar of walking two roads. And my reading of that, I don't think it's a stretch, is that he's walking both the heavenly and the human road at the same time. Because after all, it's pretty clear that the monkeys are supposed to represent human society. They're really upset about this nut distribution policy that he's proposed. So then he proposes another one. They're pleased with that one. He recognizes that it doesn't actually make a difference whether you serve 4 nuts in the morning, 3 in the evening, or 3 in the morning, 4 in the evening. At the end of the day, it's all the same. But it matters to the monkeys. And so he goes along with them, as the text says, which is meant to suggest that in some ways he's kind of both in, I don't know how to describe it. This is where I feel like we have to sort of reach for metaphors or for language to explain it. But he's sort of indulging the monkeys in their game, or sort of allowing for their perspective, making concessions to conventional monkey expectations and behaviors, even while he maintains this kind of detached distance from all those rules, expectations, and values that the monkeys seem to have. And he's able to maintain this detached distance because he recognizes that in the final analysis, or at the end of the day or something like that, it doesn't really matter which policy he pursues.
I guess one thing I've wondered about is, but he's in a way the monkey trainer himself. He doesn't like it when the monkeys get all angry, and he can't really work with the monkeys. So, yeah, I mean, isn't he also just a fully engaged participant here, operating from really just ultimately a human perspective, because he desires to harmonize with the monkeys. And so he's using this reconfiguration of the nut ratio to satisfy his own desires for them to not be so angry.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you've asked one of the questions leads us very quickly into some of the deeper issues in the Zhuangzi. So the one thing that I kind of want to insist on, there's sort of more controversial and less controversial things you can say about the Zhuangzi. It's such a profound text, and it's clear that the authors, like a lot of authors of texts in the classical period, when they were using very economical language, they meant for it to be multi-layered and contemplated and sort of approached from multiple angles. So there's a lot going on there, and it's not entirely clear how, what the nuances of the text are meant to be. But one thing that I can say with a fair amount of confidence is that the monkey trainer walking two roads metaphor is meant to suggest that in some sense we adopt both of these perspectives, both the human and heavenly perspective. Because if you think about it, the heavenly perspective, if it were really true that it doesn't matter which policy you pursue, it's not clear why you should favor the one the monkeys like over the one that makes them angry.
Right.
I guess I feel like I should say one more thing about these two points of view. I kind of emphasized that from the heavenly point of view, you should have skepticism. Obviously, the human point of view would be the counterpoint to that. You should have confidence in your beliefs. You should believe that you can know things, right? And so those are kind of two salient or distinctive features of the 2 points of view. But the one that really stands out in the Zhuangzi has to do with what I call value distinctions or collapsing value distinctions. So this monkey trainer passage appears in chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi, far and away the one that philosophers most love to write about. All the famous, not all, many of the famous stories from the Zhuangzi come from chapter 2. And chapter 2 is called Qi Yu Lun in Chinese, which translates, roughly, we can translate a number of different ways as discourses on making things equal or discourses on evening things out, something like that. And the whole idea that there are these distinctions we make, which we take to be normatively or evaluatively significant, like between good and bad, right and wrong, certainly life and death, being successful or a failure, all these distinctions that we make that are sort of normatively or evaluatively loaded, right? Those are the ones that many of the passages in chapter 2 are meant to undermine. And I think that this idea that there really, in some sense, aren't value distinctions that stand up to scrutiny, is basically a heavenly view of the world. So on my reading, the minute you start to say, well, this course of action or this way of living or this character trait or what have you, this career rather than that career, is better than another, you're adopting something that resembles the human point of view. So exactly as you were saying, Richard, it seems like the monkey trainer isn't entirely giving up on the human point of view, or in terms of the metaphor, the monkey's point of view, because he still thinks that it makes sense to kind of pursue the policy that makes the monkeys happier. So that's the part that I think is relatively uncontroversial in reading the Zhuangzi. The harder part for me is to figure out how exactly the 2 points of view are combined and also how they justify it. So the Zhuangzi is really interesting. It actually is a very philosophical text, especially on the issues that I described as heavenly ones. It offers all these skeptical arguments as reasons to doubt value distinctions. It invokes this idea that in some sense, value distinctions are all perspectival. They're sort of only true or apt or appropriate from someone's point of view. So if you adopt the heavenly point of view, that's in some sense a point of view that doesn't presuppose any value distinctions. So there's a lot of suggestions, in some cases, well-developed philosophical arguments for the heavenly point of view. But it's not entirely clear why the authors think that we should accept advantages of having this sort of combined view of the heavenly and the human.
It does seem like there's something deep and profound going on because, as you get older, like one of the things you learn is that certain things don't matter. And it takes you a long time. Part of, growing up, maybe maturing, getting older, is that you realize, those things that you were so caught up in, when you're a kid, I remember when I was 10, I just wanted, and this is a real story, this Transformer toy. And I remember crying for days. Yeah. And then, of course, I think at some point I got it, like maybe Christmas. I think I played with it for like 2 hours and then it was gone. Like I didn't care. Yeah. And then, or I remember, the first time you have like a heartbreak or something like that. And, when you were young, when you were 16, first of all, you haven't lived that long. So you don't have these experiences to inform you that time will pass. And, from a broader perspective, some of those things just don't matter. It's actually a very valuable lesson. Although it does seem like maybe some, human experience is required to learn all that. But that heavenly perspective does seem to provide that kind of that stance, that perspective from which you could realize, there's a lot of these things are kind of passing and they're not as important as you might think. And that seems actually an incredibly powerful lesson in terms of practical wisdom and advice for life. I think Zhuangzi is exceptionally good about this. And I guess the other thing I was thinking about was when you're able to take a different perspective, so sometimes, when there's a problem, when you're just inside of that perspective, it's hard to find a solution. So sometimes you got to get outside of the problem. And then from a different point of view, you can see the solution there. And so, so when you're well entrenched in the particular culture and the values, and it's hard to see maybe what might be wrong with it. So it takes sometimes a different outsider's perspective, perhaps, or someone who has an independent mind to be able to critique it. Because if you're just gripped by it and you're just living by it, then you might not quite see what's going on. So again, that seems like a very important point and a lesson.
Nice. Exactly. So the question is, why is it, on what grounds or what reasons does the text offer for adopting this dual, what I call philosophical double vision, this point of view from which we sort of both see the world as one would from the point of view of heaven, and at the same time as we would from the point of view of these sort of obviously finite and flawed and fallible human beings. One answer that really presents itself very clearly in the Taoist text is that actually, ironically, you are better at achieving human goals and purposes if you do it from this philosophical double vision perspective. So if you're capable of that kind of detachment, you're actually going to be better at achieving your tasks. What comes to mind for me is every once in a while, if you like to read studies in psychology, including these really contrived ones that they sometimes do in lab situations, you'll hear about studies where they raise the stakes on people. So I remember some years ago, there was a study showing that groups worked together to accomplish a task that required teamwork better if the reward was, I don't know, $100 or something. Whereas if you kind of raised it to $5,000, for whatever reason, they're much less likely to successfully cooperate and complete the task. Because of course, now it feels like, whoa, they've really got to succeed, because if they don't, well, what a loss it will be. Emotions get more charged, people get more sort of critical. There's a way in which sort of human beings again and again worry too much or become too invested in successful outcomes. And so the Zhuangzi's, the other thing for which it's famous are these skill stories, depictions of people who are able to perform skillful actions at an extremely high level. So the most famous one is, a story of this butcher who carves up an ox like a dance and never has to sharpen his blade because he's so good at it. So he never chips the blade. And there are others, though, of this guy who carves bell stands for these big musical performances out of trees and does it really skillfully. And there's a swimmer and so on. And one thing that's really striking about all these skill stories is that the skillful people seem to have embodied some of that heavenly detachment. So they're both engaged in human activities. I mean, they have jobs, they have professions, and they perform their job duties, So in that sense, they're pursuing, something that seems very much like it could only be warranted from this human point of view. But at the same time, they're able to maintain this heavenly frame of mind about it. And that's precisely what makes them so successful. Because they're detached in a way, they're able to kind of remain calm and cool and perform their skill-like activities at a very high level.
Yeah, that's right. And so if you're so caught up, if a surgeon is, operating on his own son, it might not be a good thing because he doesn't have the kind of the coolness or the detachment that might be necessary to carry out that task well. If you're too emotionally invested, then you might tense up, or I think in sports we call it choking. I used to play high school golf, and I had a tendency to choke these small putts, supposed to be easy, but when they counted a lot, I think what happened was I just put so much weight on it, and then I was more likely to miss that short putt that I could sink 10 times in a row just on the practice screen. So that seems like a very real thing.
Exactly. Yeah. I think of playing pool when I was younger, and I'm a lifelong amateur at playing pool. I've never been good at it, but when I was just learning, it was often when I got frustrated with myself for, missing a shot or for positioning my opponent to make a better shot or what have you. That frustration would make me a worse player. So there was this sort of cumulative effect, the more frustrated I got, the worse I would play. And then the worse I'd play, the more frustrated I'd get, and so on. So yeah, it's really apparent in sports, that phenomenon. Anyway, that points to one of the sort of justifications in the Zhuangzi for what I'm calling philosophical double vision. Another one that comes up, though, that I'm interested in is basically, it has to do with the inescapability of the human point of view. And so one of the inner chapters, I think it's chapter 4. So in Chinese, it's 人间世, which is sometimes translated as in the human realm or in the human world. There's a very memorable sort of dialogue between Kongzi, Confucius, and a sort of political figure, the Duke of Shi, he's called. And Duke of Shi is, to make a long story short, he has a really high stakes diplomatic mission, the kind that involves probably some risk to his life because he has to go travel far away through dangerous territory. It seems like he's set up to fail. He's being tasked with persuading someone who seems perfectly unpersuadable. And so no one's going to be happy with him. And so he's really stressed out. And Confucius, who stands in as a kind of quasi-Taoist figure in the Zhuangzi. So that's
very interesting because sometimes people think, oh, he's kind of an enemy, but it's kind of it's very complicated, right? The way that Confucius is presented in the Zhuangzi.
Yeah, it's one of those, it's like people are always shocked. I think Western readers, especially, who are so accustomed to thinking, well, Confucianism and Taoism are rival schools. So why do we even see Confucius being portrayed as a wise person in these texts? I find this kind of human heavenly perspective, this framework, really useful for thinking about the role of Confucius in the Zhuangzi. This doesn't work in every case because the Zhuangzi is an eclectic text, but oftentimes when Confucius is portrayed as kind of a sage or wise figure, he's still one who's kind of self-effacing enough to recognize that he has certain limits. I tend to read him as someone who hasn't fully been able to capture the heavenly point of view, but he knows that it's out there. He knows that it's this great achievement for which he admires and looks up to other people who are able to achieve it. So he kind of like sort of represents the most enlightened take on the human point of view. And that's what he's doing here. So in this dialogue, this Duke is stressed out about his mission, and he's gulping ice water. He's so hot, he's running such a high temperature from the stress. And Confucius basically says to him, listen, there's nothing you can do about this. Like, even if this mission weren't your mission, you would still be stuck in this world with expectations of you. So there are these moral norms that people seem to care a lot about, righteousness and benevolence, and in some way they're fated. You can't escape them. No matter where you go, you're going to have things you care about, people you're attached to. I think we can sort of abstract from the argument that he makes there and just say, presupposing value distinctions is itself unavoidable. If you imagine someone who adopts the purest version of the heavenly point of view and says, there really is fundamentally no reason to prefer one course of action over another, one outcome over another. There's no reason to think it's better to be a successful politician than someone who has no career at all or what have you, or a farmer. If that's your view, it's hard to imagine what follows from it. Does it mean that you should just stop trying and go to sleep or doom scroll on your phone all the time? No, that doesn't follow either, right? Because that's already to indicate that there's some better way to live. So it's sort of like the human point of view is inescapable. And that's the other argument that I think that you sometimes catch glimpses of in the Zhuangzi.
Yeah. And actually, not to get into the weeds about free will, but there's a fundamental debate among free will theorists because it's so connected to moral responsibility. And there's this famous paper by Strawson, P.F. Strawson, called Reactive Attitudes. Wonderful, beautiful paper. And basically, he's a kind of compatibilist. And I don't want to say too much technical words here, but basically, he thinks free will exists, although he thinks determinism is true, that
causal determinism.
That the past determines a unique future. But ultimately, he thinks that we have to accept free will because it's wrapped up with deeply human emotions, these reactive attitudes of feelings of guilt, of anger, of pride. And in a way, what Strawson argues there in a very different way from Zhuangzi, of course, is that, you can't escape this kind of human perspective. And in fact, in order to see ourselves as human persons or agents and to see other people as agents or persons, you have to take on this way of seeing the world, this human way of seeing the world. So I think Strawson would certainly agree there that we just cannot escape from it. You're going to take up one over another. And insofar as you're going to continue living and acting in the world.
Yeah, definitely. I see the same sort of argument template being applied in both cases in the same way.
So real quick, though, then, is the heavenly perspective because the way I always thought about it, which was in some ways helpful for me practically, the heavenly perspective, I guess I can almost see as a kind of a practical tool. Because in a way, I come to accept that, I'm a human being. I make distinctions and there's no way out. Hopefully, what I think I can learn from Zhuangzi is that, sometimes maybe it's good to critique my own way of judgment or evaluating, and because it could be flawed and maybe there's a better way of doing it. So that's great.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I have to do it. I mean, insofar as I think there's goodness, justice, and so on, and beauty. But then the heavenly perspective it does seem like a very important tool, because if you're too into something, if you're gripped by something, it could become very unhealthy. But of course, even that just means that your practical life will be injured or harmed. I guess I've never quite figured out how to really give equal weight to both perspectives. Maybe I have some kind of Confucian leaning here. I don't know. But because a human perspective seems like the fundamental point of view. And then the heavenly perspective I can really appreciate. And I think I should try to cultivate in myself, especially in different times in my life. But it seems more like I would describe it as a tool for me rather than just like an equal perspective that I can just adopt in a full-blown way.
Yeah. I mean, this is where to begin. As I was sort of saying earlier, there's like the more and less controversial issues that we could talk about when it comes to interpreting the Zhuangzi. And now we're getting into deep waters where any attempt to generalize is going to be fraught with peril and controversy. So how exactly do we understand the combination of the two points of view? How is it that heavenly point of view is integrated into the human one and vice versa? That's a really deep and interesting question. I think maybe it would help to just kind of think of some analogies or metaphors to kind of at least lay the ground and present some options. So one option that I think you just suggested, Richard, is what I want to call like the strategic use of the heavenly point of view. So the idea here is that, as you said, the heavenly point of view is a tool that you can adopt. So for me, the sort of paradigm case of strategically using the heavenly point of view is like having some goal in life that you strive for really hard. Like, I don't know, maybe you want to become in university and you are a pre-med major, which is very competitive. So you have to get very good grades in these kind of weed out classes that are meant to discourage people from being pre-meds. And at some point you just realize it's not going to happen. Your grades aren't good enough. You just don't have the passion for it or what have you. And so you realize it's time for a career change. So on the sort of strategic understanding of philosophical double vision, now you pull out this sort of weapon or tool, heavenly point of view, and you remind yourself, at the end of the day, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter whether I'm a doctor or a physician's assistant or a lawyer or something else entirely, And also, how do I know that being a doctor would be great for me? It seems that's rather presumptuous.
Mm-hmm. In fact, Zhuangzi raises those kinds of questions all the time, right? By providing like different frames of reference. There's that passage where like some women, I don't know if she gets captured or like there's this beautiful woman who is pulled from her town or her family and gets wedded to the prince or king, I can't remember. And at first, of course, she's just totally distraught. But then later she's like, oh, this is kind of good. And so there's all these passages where, from the point of view of a snake, like what's good environment to live in is totally different from, obviously from a bird and from us. And so Zhuangzi continuously raises these questions to question whether, what we deem to be harmful or good for us, it really is so.
Yes, exactly. So the idea is, right, you remind yourself of all of these stories of people who thought that they were about to enter a tragic situation, like that famous beauty who was wedded to sort of our barbarian foreign ruler, cried and sobbed about it, but ended up being very happy with her new life. So similarly, if you realize that maybe being a doctor isn't in the cards for you and you end up having some other career, like as a vet or what have you, how do you know that wouldn't in fact be better for you? And at the end of the day, you don't have good reason to prefer one over the other.
This is where I wonder if the old man loses a horse passage is, of course, fitting. And actually now I wonder if that might be a fitting, like, final kind of story to bring up at the end of our conversation about detachment.
It's a Han Dynasty text, so it appears later in classical or maybe just post-classical Chinese philosophy. It's called the Huainanzi. And it dabbles in some Confucianism, some legalism, and some Taoism. And one of the Taoist passages is super famous. It tells the story of an old man who's wise enough to recognize that there's so little he can know about good and bad fortune. It sort of follows his story basically through the ups and downs of his life and his son's life, mostly his son. So there are these, back at that time, of course, horses were really valuable, and a particularly fine breed of horse just kind of roams onto his property. And everyone considers how that he and his family have really struck it rich because they have this horse and they're really pleased. And he more or less says, how do I know? What makes you think that this is a good fortune for me? And so then through twists and turns, his son falls off the horse and becomes lame. And so everyone thinks that's a tragedy because, of course, if you live in the hinterlands there, if you live in the borderlands with a farm, you really need able-bodied people, both to kind of defend you and also to help farm and that kind of thing. So everyone considers it a tragedy. And he says, well, how do we know that? How do we know that this is tragic? Then, people are drafted to go to war against barbarians just outside the border. And his son isn't drafted on account of being lame from his injury and so on and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the point is there's really so little that you can know just in terms of like knowing the outcomes of events. So if you're trying to console yourself about not successfully becoming a doctor, that's one way you can do it. But there are all these other ways too. And among them are the idea that basically it may be that your sense that being a doctor was somehow better for you, or somehow more virtuous or more conducive to living an excellent life or a meaningful life or what have you. Maybe that was wrong. After all, in the grand scheme of things, we're no better positioned than the morning mushroom. There's so much that we don't know. There's so much that we haven't experienced. There's so much that has sort of yet to be revealed that it's sort of crazy to think that we could ever make any claim to knowing what sort of life is best for us. And for what it's worth, the one value distinction that is always sort of understood in the Zhuangzi as the tough nut to crack, as the hardest value distinction to overcome, the one that comes most naturally to us as humans, and yet the one that good Taoists in the mold of Zhuangzi aspire to collapse, is the distinction between life and death itself. Mm-hmm. So the Zhuangzi is meant to sort of undermine our confidence that it's better to live, and it's better to live a nice long life than to die or to die young. So even that comes in for scrutiny and doubt. And so certainly things like, if that's true, you don't have very good reasons to believe it's better to live to a ripe old age, then it doesn't seem like such a stretch to say it's, there's no particular reason to think that you're better off as a doctor.
That's pretty extreme. That's tough.
Yeah.
And certainly I'm going to try to preserve my own life and the life of my kids. Yeah. But I remember, right, there's that passage, I forgot, maybe it's chapter 18 or 19, where Zhuangzi is talking, or maybe he's dreaming, he's having a dream about the skull. I forgot if it's a dream or if he's just thinking about it, or, I thought it was a dream where he's talking to a skull, someone who's dead, long dead. And ultimately, the skull's like, oh, I'm good where I am. Like, thank goodness. Because I think Zhuangzi asked him, oh, what if you could have your life back? And he's like, why would I want to go back to that? That was awful. There's suffering, there's pain, misery, and, anxiety. And I'm think about how happy I am, and how are you doing?
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting. I mean, it's such a terrifically interesting conversation there. I mean, I think that's why Zhuangzi is just this amazing text. I wish more people read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So for what it's worth, Richard, you guessed rightly. I take a lot of pride in remembering the passage numbers. That was chapter 18, and that's the sort of supreme happiness chapter. Luz is the Chinese, can be translated as supreme happiness, supreme joy, maybe arriving at happiness or arriving at joy. Anyway, there's this very memorable kind of, I think of it as like the Shakespeare, speaking to the skull type story, the Yorick story about, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. That's the Hamlet soliloquy. Mm-hmm. It's like that. He's talking to this skull, although it has to be trippier being Zhuangzi. So what happens is he encounters the skull, and then he uses it as a headrest back when people were comfortable with hard headrests. And so he's sleeping on the skull at night when the skull appears to him in a dream. He and the skull have a dialogue, and the skull convinces him that there's no particular reason to regret the loss of life, because life is full of, it comes at a net loss, is what the skull's argument is. You're so harried when you're alive. You're just sort of frantically running around from one task to the next, always, kind of wrapped up in, you have all these entanglements in these requirements and, things that are demanded of you. He says his life is better than that of an emperor or king. So if you just look at it in terms of like, how much stress and anxiety he manages to avoid by being dead. That's another good example. The Zhuangzi is full of arguments meant to sort of undermine our confidence that it's better to be alive than dead. And yet there's no question in my mind that the Zhuangzi recommends that we, try to stay healthy and live to a ripe old age if we can. There are even some passages where it gives it away. So there again, we see hints of the what I want to call the philosophical double vision, this idea that you don't let go of the human point of view entirely. You continue to pursue human goals and human aspirations. I did want to mention, though, that what I'm calling the strategic use of heaven may not be the right one. I mean, I was sort of setting it up earlier, this person who wants to be a doctor, in a way to sort of present what I think is sort of inadequate about it, because I'm picturing someone who's basically really, really invested in becoming a doctor. So, she's like studying really hard for her exams. She's taking all the right classes. She's going to her advisor and making sure that she's doing all the right things, checking all the boxes that you're supposed to check off if you want to apply to med school and get in. And when she gets bad grades in intro bio or biochemistry or what have you, organic bio, she's really frustrated with herself and so on. That clearly isn't a way of living that the Zhuangzi recommends to us. So I think that there are other models of detachment that we could consider, but I myself haven't really figured out the right model. I haven't decided what model is the correct one. But I'll just mention one more if it's okay with you. I feel like it's inadequate too, but I'm just going to say it. Like, I want to call it the Monopoly model of detachment. So what I mean is, like, when you play Monopoly, which is this sort of, I don't know, I think most people still know what that game is. It's this game where you like strive to buy up as much of the property as possible and sort of prevail in real estate over others.
Yeah, I used to love it.
Yeah, I did too. And I was really competitive too.
Yeah, me too.
But when you play it, I mean, you understand, of course, that funny thing is that there's all these kind of fake US dollar bills, ones, fives, tens, 50s, hundreds, and 500s. But of course, you recognize that it's fake and it's not going to actually buy you anything. You're in the game to win, and you're behaving as though the money has some value. But in some sense, you recognize, of course, that it's just a game and it doesn't have value. Mm-hmm. And I've often wondered if that kind of game-like attitude captures what it's like to be the monkey trainer, or just to be, in general, a Taoist sage figure who approaches human life that way. You're still playing the game. You're still playing the human game. You still do the stuff that humans do. So you still have a career, for example. You're still trying to stay healthy and live to an old age. You're still, supporting people and so on. But in some sense, you refrain from assenting or something to the belief that it actually matters. Just like you refrain from assenting to the belief that it really matters whether you win Monopoly. You don't actually believe that you're getting rich, by winning the game, or getting poor by losing it. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if that analogy helps, or if it's in fact misleading, because in some ways it kind of diminishes human life to say, well, it's all just a game anyway.
Yeah. So if you take someone who, doesn't care at all about baseball, maybe doesn't even know the rules, and then they go to a game, and then you see, let's say it's like the World Series, right? Game 7 or something like that. And you see people just emotional, just like each pitch and bat, it's just so important to these people. And, but you're just looking at this weird event unfold with some people throwing a ball toward another direction, and some guy with a stick trying to hit it. And, you can imagine like aliens coming down and thinking, what is this? Like, why are they doing this? Like, I guess that's a kind of detached external point of view. And I guess you can note like, oh yeah, like they feel happy if this happens, but they feel sad if this other thing happens, and they're all caught up in it. I guess that's a very totally different perspective from someone who just loves baseball, right? And knows the history and knows, like in it, they are engaged, right? They're an engaged participant. And so one thing that's interesting is, I guess some things it's good to take that perspective. I don't know about baseball, but sometimes certain games you're just like, you should kind of like realize, no, it's just a game, and you move on. But let's say like something like the death of your child, or, I mean, there's such significant events in human life. I mean, if we took that detached, external point of view, it does seem like there's something off about it, at least from my point of view. Oh, like this kid died who happens to be my daughter. I mean, that there's something, you'd almost wonder if there's some kind of, psychopathy. I don't know. Something's strange there. Yeah. I wonder.
Seems like a sociopath, someone who's not.
Not living actually. And there's something kind of maybe even sad about someone who's unable to because if you love someone, you can't take that perspective. And I wonder what Zhuangzi would say about that kind of point. I mean, Zhuangzi also, of course, in chapter 18 talks about how his wife died, or at least Zhuangzi doesn't talk about it, but at least there's the story about Zhuangzi losing his wife, which is pretty famous. And he does grieve. It looks like he does cry in the beginning. But then, of course, he goes towards the heavenly perspective afterwards.
Right. So you've put your finger on what I take to be one of the major critiques of Taoist detachment, which is basically that it deprives you of access to certain really important goods in life. Things like relationships, things like, I don't know, passion projects, things that you care about, which necessarily require some risk. You put yourself in some vulnerability. So you make yourself vulnerable to tragedy and to bad things happening, just insofar as you care about the outcomes of things, and insofar as you care or become attached to the people that you love. Maybe that's one of the things that Xunzi, this Confucian critic of Zhuangzi, early Confucian critic, had in mind when he said that Zhuangzi was fixated on or obsessed with heaven and the expense of the human. So one thing that we could maybe say in Zhuangzi's defense is that, at least as he's depicted in chapter 18, when he's mourning his wife, it basically says that he started out, of course how could he not be attached to his wife? He raised children with her. He grew old with her. So he was crying, just as anyone would expect, he said. But by the time his friend finds him, he's moved past the grief stage, and he's sort of singing and pounding on a wash tub and sort of celebrating, because he realizes that in some ways she's just transformed again. She transformed into a living creature at one point, then she transformed into an older person, then a very elderly person. And now she's transformed yet again. This is something to be embraced, not to be mourned. And what I like about the passage is that it depicts Zhuangzi as at least somewhat relatably human, But so he still has some of those goods of life, and it seems like he could argue that he did have a meaningful relationship with his wife. I mean, so much so that he couldn't help but cry, but he still manages to achieve some of that kind of distance that the heavenly point of view is supposed to achieve. I'm not sure that I'm satisfied with it. And by the way, there is some controversy or some debate about whether that passage really belongs to the core Zhuangzi, because there are other depictions of people who adopt the heavenly human points of view at the same time, where the people who walk two roads and kind of manage to maintain both perspectives basically don't get emotional at all. So in that case, we see Zhuangzi getting emotional. First, he's sad. Later, he's celebratory and singing and playing music. But the sage figures are often kind of depicted as like even grieving and crying on the outside, while they don't actually feel any inner sadness. So one thing, the really interesting phenomenon in the Zhuangzi is there are these stories of sort of ideal grievers. So for example, chapter 6, which is sometimes translated as the great ancestral teacher, there's this student of Confucius who asks Confucius about a famous mourner named Meng Sun Cai. And everyone says Meng Sun Cai is really great at mourning, which is actually kind of something that was held in relatively high esteem in ancient times, because it showed how filial you were if you mourned your parents, and if you showed.
Aren't people sometimes paid to be mourners?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, right. To this day, right. You sometimes hire people to pretend to cry at funerals and that kind of thing. Yeah, so mourning well is a valuable thing. Meng Sun Cai is very good at it. But Confucius' student asks him, and this is again the kind of quasi-Taoist Confucius, right? Because it's in the Zhuangzi. Confucius' student asks his teacher, why is he considered so great? I mean, everyone says that he basically didn't grieve. He cried without tears, in his inner heart, he did not mourn. And Kong's answer, I have it here, I'll read it for you. He says, Meng Sun does not know why he lives. He does not know why he dies. He's not aware of moving forward. He's not aware of falling back. So you see that sort of collapsing of value distinctions. He changes into something. He lets the unknown change finish it. All right. So he's sort of willing to accept change. And death is supposed to, sort of on the Zhuangzian scheme, just supposed to be understood as another change. When he changes, how does he know he isn't not changing? When he doesn't change, how does he know he hasn't changed already? So take you and me. We're dreaming and haven't woken up. But something can shock his body without harming his mind. He stays here only for a day, but feels no death. Meng Sun is awake. And then here's the key line. People cry, so he cries. This is why. So Confucius's attempt to explain to his student why Meng Sun Cai is a great griever is answered in that last line. People cry, so he cries. This is why. Well, I feel
like, what does that mean actually at the end there? Like what, he just he's following like a script kind of fulfilling a social role or just kind of psychologically.
Yeah. I mean, that's one way of reading it. And traditional commentators have said so. So like people sometimes point to the similarity between the monkey trainer and Meng Sun Tsai. Both seem to just be going along with what others do. The monkey trainer sees for himself that it doesn't matter whether he follows the 4 nuts in the morning, 3 nuts in the evening policy, or the 3 nuts in the morning, 4 nuts in the evening policy. They're all equal at the end of the day. But he still decides it's best to do what makes the monkeys happy. It seems like the upshot here in this story of this great mourner is similar. People cry, so he cries. This is why. He's just kind of going along with people. And there we get back to my sort of game analogy, which is both, I think, somewhat helpful in figuring out the kind of detachment that you're supposed to achieve, but also a little disappointing because I don't just want to be playing a game, you know? It's hard not to shake this conviction that in some way what you do has to really matter.
Yeah. Okay. What's a little unsettling is that if we put it like as if it's just a game like Monopoly, then it seems like life, all these what we deem to be extremely important, significant relationships and events and goals and tasks are just really, in a way, they're just artificial kind of events that just like take them or leave them from at least from the heavenly perspective. And it seems to trivialize. And so if you go really into the heavenly perspective, yeah, I wonder if you can start feeling a sense of meaninglessness and like a kind of like I wouldn't want teenagers to really get into that perspective. They might just could be like, well, become kind of get that kind of existentialist angst or or just start lacking any kind of motivation. That would be a little worrisome. Yeah, because nothing really matters, and so that does seem like a possible danger for at least for certain people.
Yeah. I suspect that there are some committed Taoists out there, people committed to Zhuangzi in particular, who could defend Zhuangzi against that worry, but it's still one that looms large for me. I will say, though, that like in terms of the general picture of the kind of ideal way of life as Zhuangzi depicts it, it is pretty appealing. So what he has basically are people who are very good at both maintaining that kind of heavenly distance and equanimity and peace of mind that you get from the heavenly point of view, while at the same time playing the human game. And it seems to be suggested that, in fact, because they're so good at maintaining that kind of heavenly distance and that heavenly point of view, they exceed at playing the human game. They do much better than other people. So he has all these people who are sort of really great, kind of famous really for their skills of one kind or another, like fishing, swimming, butchery, wood carving. And so much so that you kind of, if you're occupying the human point of view, you're tempted to envy them. And yet they have this adaptability and versatility, which is hard not to envy as well. Mm-hmm. So insofar as he's describing a way of life that's actually possible for people by adopting what I'm calling philosophical double vision, it is a very appealing one. But at the end of the day, yes, I still worry that one regards one's sort of important life tasks and relationships and that sort of thing too trivially, almost laughably. I mean, quite often you're meant to laugh at the people who are so invested in their lives and in their values. And one wonders what effect that would have on the psyche.
Yeah, for certain things, you try to grow out of it. And if you care too much about what other people think about you, we realize over time, like it doesn't really matter as much as we thought. But for other things, we think, oh, no, these are profound human goods of family, friendship, growth in like our understanding of beauty, art, literature, music. And then maybe as we get older, we appreciate those things more. So, but of course, I'm bringing to bear some kind of value distinction here.
Yeah. Well, here's a crazy idea. How about reading? I don't know if this is consistent with the sort of spirit of the text or not, but here's one idea. We could read Zhuangzi as offering a kind of non-ideal theory about the good life, where basically what the text is trying to do is both help induce philosophical attitudes, we might call them, and also justify certain attitudes, which will be, if not ideal, nevertheless much better for us. You know what I mean? So sometimes people talk about non-ideal theory in political philosophy, like we should just worry about improving governance and social justice and data politics and so on. We shouldn't worry about what the ideal would look like. Maybe defenders of Zhuangzi could make a similar move here. Like, okay, true. If somehow you're able to achieve this sagely aloofness and distance from human life, then we really should worry about your state of health, because you're going to be regarding everything as trivial and laughable and and you might worry that you're going to have an existential crisis of some kind, get depressed. But don't worry about that, because in fact, you are a human being and you do care a lot about your projects. Maybe by reading the Zhuangzi, puzzling it over, really internalizing these images and these metaphors and these stories, we can take you a few notches closer to that sort of sagely detachment. But as for the question of what happens in the extreme case, we don't have to worry about it because we're never going to get there. So
I like that thought a lot. And in fact, in history, so you noted earlier that some people just think, oh, Confucians and Taoists were sort of at each other's throats. But a lot of Confucians actually enjoyed reading the Taoist text. Like they would read it on their own, as maybe part of it was that it gave them a kind of refreshment, some kind of leisure, to sort of remove themselves from the hustle and bustle of daily life. And so the Taoist perspective was kind of refreshing to them, that they could find a way of detaching themselves from being so caught up in the daily struggles. So maybe our general tendency, you're suggesting, might be to be too caught up in these things. And Zhuangzi is insightful in that way, that, that's the direction our natural psychology tends toward. And so he's giving some relief to that kind of tendency.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's this, what I call it, a stereotype or kind of widespread social expectation that there's a certain trajectory of life, especially for sorts of people in pre-modern China who were very well educated, where they have a certain number of years, sort of peak, young and middle-aged years, when they're very much career-oriented and wrapped up in politics, and their work as officials, people who were literate, who were highly literate, who could read philosophical texts and poetry and history, generally found themselves in this world where they aspired to work for government in office, take official positions. And so there's a stage of your life where you're supposed to do that. And in those stages, Confucianism is the philosophy for you. But then there's retirement, and Zhuangzi begins to appeal in your retirement. I have to say, when I turned 40, I'm 49 now, I'll just fess up right away. When I turned 40, I had my version of a midlife crisis, and it wasn't like, I didn't
the
go
Ferrari
buy. Yeah, no, it wasn't like that. And I couldn't afford a Ferrari anyway. But I admit that like the kind of scholarship I do as a professional philosopher is pretty geeky and technical. I mean, I'm very interested in the use of technical terms and sort of long lost arguments and lines of argument and justification that appear in later Chinese philosophy, stuff that hasn't been translated. So I really geek out on that. But I kind of realized that I was no longer working on the stuff that first roped me in, the stuff that made me kind of fall in love with philosophy in the first place. So I ended up designing a course called Philosophy and Personal Development. And it was really just kind of an excuse to read more Zhuangzi, more early Buddhism, more Stoics, Epicureans, the philosophers that sort of envision philosophy as medicine for the soul. And I found again and again that I wanted to put Zhuangzi last. The sort of open secret among philosophy professors is that you always put the position or philosopher that you agree with last.
Yes.
Because the idea is that you walk through all the positions you disagree with and then present the one that you agree with as somehow dodging all the bullets that the others couldn't dodge. So
yes.
Yeah. So Zhuangzi ended up being the sort of star of that class. And he still is. It's funny. I'm not someone who publishes on Zhuangzi regularly, but as you mentioned, we have this reading group where we read him all the time. And it's still the text that I most want to figure out. And it's the one that I actually have dreams about, and that I really find myself mulling over and trying to sort of piece together in my idle moments.
I mean, it's just such a beautiful text. It just has this breadth of vision and just this expansive outlook that's just really just refreshing. I mean, this dates back to what, around 400 BCE. So that's a long time ago. And we know that Zhuangzi at least was a real historical figure and probably extremely, obviously brilliant and also well-educated. But for that time, it's just incredible that these ideas flow through his mind. I totally agree that it's just a wonderful text that I hope all the listeners will read on their own. That would be very gratifying.
And I think both you and I love the text so much. I'm sure we'll have more passages and more themes to discuss. I feel like we've really barely begun to look at the first foot of the tip of the iceberg that is the text. But I hope it's been a relatively good point of entry. I mean, I often find that when you're reading ancient texts like this one that were written for very different audiences, a lot of people start to read them and they have no idea what sense to make of them. I think I mentioned earlier when I was young, I would carry the Tao Te Ching around cover out so as to create the impression that it was a book I understood, even though it wasn't, you know.
I used to carry a Plato's Republic, I think, also.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
In a similar way.
Yeah, there's this portrait of the philosopher as a young man. There's a chapter in one of Nozick's books where he describes himself doing that with Plato's Republic. And I thought, oh, that was me with the Tao Te Ching. Anyway, yeah, we all did some of that, right? We did that not just with philosophy texts, but with others. I find that if you go into these old texts without any sort of framework at all, it's kind of hard to make sense of it. But I do think that the heaven, human points of view framework, philosophical double vision, if you have that framework in mind when you begin reading the core Zhuangzi chapters, like the inner chapters and some others, including chapter 18, Supreme Happiness, the one that you mentioned earlier, Richard, that'll help a lot. It'll help you make sense of the sort of positions that are being entertained. And it'll also help you avoid the mistake, which I think really is a mistake, of thinking that the Zhuangzi ultimately just endorses this, what we might call a kind of purely heavenly point of view and the way of life that might seem to follow from that. There is no way of life that follows from it, sort of my view. And the Zhuangzi doesn't pretend that there is.
Yeah, I think that framework is very useful. And so I hope the listeners will read through it. Hopefully that our conversation has helped them to read the text and get more out of it.
Yeah, we'll put links to some of the relevant stuff that we mentioned today in the show notes. Oh, we did want to mention we have another episode coming up, and it's going to be about shame. Shame is a moral emotion in the Confucian tradition. That's what we have to look forward to. We expect it to be a good discussion. We'll have a guest specialist on this very issue. That'll be the topic for episode 2. So that was the way for today, and we'll see you next time.